So, as I just said, let's now start with the feature of uploading a new recipe and start with the ability of opening the model window which contains the form to add the new recipe. So in the demo version, this is what it looks like. So here we click Add Recipe, and then it opens up this form like this. And then when we click this button or click outside of the form, then that window will again close. All right, so let's do that, and let's create a new bookmarks view. And actually not a bookmarks view, but a add recipe view.js. And now let's go to one of these views and copy the code from there, because this code is always very similar. So let's delete this one here. Let's empty out this method. And then here, let's call it add recipe view. Now, this view here is actually going to be quite different from the other views, because we already have actually the view in the HTML. So if we come here to our HTML code, then you see that the form that we want to display is actually already here in the code. All right. So here we have this element for the overlay and this element for the window, and they both have the hidden class. And so showing the window and the overlay is going to be as simple as removing this hidden class from both these elements. Now, the main element that we are actually really interested in is this upload element. And so let's actually make this upload element the parent element of the add recipe view. So upload here, but then we will also have to select some other elements. So for example, the window and the overlay. So to start at least. So the window element is going to be document.querySelector. And then let's see what we have here. Here we can close all of these for now. So that's add recipe window. And then the overlay has simply the overlay class. And so here, overlay, and here as well. And here we are missing the dot on both selectors. And now we also need to select the button that will be clicked to open the window, and also the button to close the window. So that button is somewhere here in the top navigation bar. So this is for the bookmarks. And here it is. So this is the button for adding the recipe, as you see. So let's call that the button open. And then also the button to close the form. And so that's back here somewhere in the window. So that's button close modal. Okay. And here. Okay. And so now let's listen for the events. So of clicking the open button and the close button. Okay. And as always, we will do that in a method called addHandler and then something, just to make it more consistent. So addHandler show window, let's say. And so here we will want to select the button. So button open dot add event listener of a click. And so when that happens, what do we want to do? Well, we want to take the overlay in the window and remove the hidden class. So that's this dot overlay dot class list dot remove. Now, instead of remove, we can actually also use toggle. So remember that toggle will add the class if it's not there, and it will remove the class when it is already there. And so this will make it a lot easier to then reuse this class. So the overlay and also the window. Okay. Now, when do we actually want this function here to be called? Well, we want this to be called as soon as the page loads. Now, in this case, this has nothing to do with any controller, because there's nothing special happening here that the controller needs to tell us, right? So when this click happens on the button open, all that will happen is really for the window to show. So the controller doesn't need to interfere in any of this. And so therefore, we can simply run this function here as soon as this object is created. And so what I'm going to do is to this time add a constructor method. Then since this is a child class, we need to start by calling super. And so only after that we can use the this keyword. And then let's say this dot add handler show window. And so this one here is now only going to be used inside of this class. And so let's add an underscore to mark it as protected. And so again, in order to show this window, the controller does not interfere at all. All right. Now, what we will have to do in the controller still is to import this object here, because otherwise our main script, so the controller, will never execute this file. And so then this object here will never be created. And so the event listener here would then never be added. And so we need to, again, import this so that the code that is in the module is actually being run. So here, let's call that the add recipe view. And now let's check out our code just to make sure we reload it. And we get a class list of undefined. So some small bug here. And again, you see how common that is. So let's again see which line that actually was. So line 19. So with the overlay. So let's see if the class is correct. Well, it looks so. Oh, but I can see the error now. So here we are using the this keyword inside of a handler, right? But you already know that the this keyword inside of a handler function points to the element on which that listener is attached to. So in this case, that is this button here. And so let's actually export this entire function into another method and then call that method with the correct this keyword bound to it. So here is what I mean. Toggle window, let's say, will do this. And then here we want to call this dot toggle window. And now here we can use our bind method as always, and then bind the correct this keyword. So we have done this many times before. So basically manually setting the this keyword inside of this function here now to the this keyword that we actually want it to be. And so right here, this of course points to the current object, because otherwise, again, the this keyword inside of this function would be the button on which the event listener is attached to. And so with this, it should now work. And yeah, there is our form. And now all we have to do is to close that form when we click this button or click outside here. So add handler hide window. And so that's actually very similar to this one. Let's just duplicate it actually. So button close. And then the same also on the overlay. And so that's why this toggle here is now very useful. Because here at this point, when we want to hide the window, then the hidden class is no longer there, but it will then automatically add it back on. Oh, and before we actually try it, we first, of course, need to call this method here as well. Okay, and it's gone. Great. So that works. And so next up, let's take care of handling this button here. And for now, what we want to do when we click this button is to get all the data here out of this form. And you see that I already have like pre-filled this data here. And so that comes from the HTML here because the value is basically already set. But then of course, by the end, we will remove this. So this is just for development purposes. But anyway, let's now create another method here, which is going to handle the click on that button. So basically the form submission. So add handler upload. And so here we will now actually listen for an event right on the parent element. So that is the upload form itself. So parent element dot add event listener for submit. And then in our function, as always, the first thing is to prevent default. So here we need access to the event prevent default. And now, how do we get access to all of these values? Well, we could go ahead and select all of these form elements one by one and then read the value property of all of them. However, there's actually an easier way because we can use something called form data. So that's a pretty modern browser API that we can now make use of. So let's say data equals, and then we can create a new form data. And into the form data constructor, we have to pass in an element that is a form. And so that form, in this case, is the this keyword, right? Because we are inside of a handler function, and so this points to this.parent element, which is, of course, the upload form. Now this here will then return a weird object that we cannot really use, but we can actually spread that object into an array, like this. All right, and so this will then basically give us an array which contains all the fields with all the values in there. So let's then log that data to the console. Now let's think what we actually want to do with this data eventually. So this data right here is the data that we eventually will want to use to upload to the API, right? And that action of uploading the data is going to be just another API call, right? And where do API calls happen? Well, they happen in the model. And so therefore, we will need a way of getting this data to the model. So just like we did many times before, we now need to create a controller function, which will then be the handler of this event. Okay, so let's come down here and create control add recipe. And so this function here will then actually receive the new recipe data. And let's actually have this one here log the data to the console. So new recipe. Okay, and now all we have to do is to say add recipe view dot add handler upload, and then control add the recipe. So this is the publisher subscriber pattern that we have used many times before. And so eventually here we will have some function to then upload the new recipe data. Okay? And so here we now need to accept this handler function, and then we need to call it. So instead of logging it to the console right here, we will simply call the handler function. And so this handler function will then, for now, log it to the console. Because, again, that handler is now this control add recipe. All right, so let's see what happens. And so that's why I have all of these pre-filled data now, so that we can simply click the upload button and then get our data down here immediately. So let's now take a look at that data. And so since we got that data, it means that everything is correctly set up, which is great. And so here we get the array of multiple arrays in there. So basically the entries of this form, where the first element is always the name of the field, and the second one is the value. All right. So title, source URL, and you see all of them here. Okay. Now, usually our recipe data is always an object and not an array of entries like this. And so in JavaScript, since ES 2019, there's now a new and very handy method that we can use to convert entries to an object. So let's actually call this one here data array. And then the data itself is going to be object dot from entries, and then the data array. And so this from entries method here is basically the opposite of the entries method that is available on arrays, right? So this one takes an array of entries and converts it to an object. So let's see what that looks like in practice. And beautiful. So this looks already a lot more like our original recipe object, like this one here, for example. It is, of course, still missing some formatting, and it is still missing some data like the ID, but that we will take care of in the model. And so let's go do that in the next video.